The city of Beirut marks the sad anniversary of the explosion there, as a leaked FBI report confirms what we suspected. House Republicans release a report stating their belief that the evidence now supports the lab leak hypothesis. And how are the issues of vaccines and ivermectin tearing apart the community of heterodox thinkers? Let's have a look. This is an update video looking at some of the recent developments in the issues that I've covered in the past, particularly on what people have been saying about some of the important discussions that have been taking place around them. First of all, the day this video goes live is the unhappy 1-year anniversary of the explosion in Beirut. I did a couple of videos in the aftermath of that event looking at the emerging evidence for how a pile of explosive ammonium sulphate ended up stored in that hangar in the port of Beirut. And with all the trails there had been, I concluded that it was highly likely that its transport to Beirut had been engineered by Hezbollah, which has a history of using ammonium sulphate as an explosive. Nothing has gotten better for Beirut or the people of Lebanon since all of that happened. The country has been led astonishingly badly by factional forces that survived the wave of outrage in the wake of the explosion and continues to operate more or less with impunity. Meanwhile, Lebanon's economy has collapsed, the currency has died 15-fold in value. Hyperinflation means that the basic necessities have been priced out of the reach of a huge part of the population. Its energy supplies have dried up thanks to the badly run state electricity provider, which is being kept going with rapidly disappearing funds from the central bank, meaning that it's subject to frequent blackouts with only the prospect of much worse to come. As someone who visited Beirut a number of times before all this happened, who knows people there, it is heartbreaking to see. A cultured, civilized people have been reduced to abject poverty and a sense of hopelessness. In the meantime, a leaked report from the FBI has emerged to say that the explosion at the port was compatible with only 550 tonnes of ammonium sulphate, rather than the 2,750 tonnes that came with the ship. This very much supports the conclusion that I suggested as most likely, that it was stored at the port permanently because it gave Hezbollah easy access to move it as required without much visibility. And they'd been gradually taking what they wanted over the years that it was stored there. Now, on the one hand, thank goodness, because if the full original load had still been there, the explosion in Beirut would have been significantly even worse than it was. On the other hand, people in Beirut have known that this was the truth right back when I made at least the second video. And they've seen that the people concerned have not been held to account. It's one of the biggest crimes of our age, and the criminals are still largely running the place. I can only hope that there'll be a better story to tell once we reach the second anniversary. Then, while we're in slightly sombre mood, let's move from one disaster to another. This week, the Republicans in Congress have produced a report that takes as its premise that COVID-19 came from a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute. They called the leak the greatest cover-up of all time and decided to go with the implication of a bunch of persuasive but still circumstantial evidence. At this stage, there's an argument for that, since China is determinedly refusing to be transparent or to cooperate, to presume that this is because of a lab leak and using that as a starting point conclusion, while of course inviting new evidence or cooperation to show otherwise. It is a defensible conclusion. This is the timeline as they describe it. It is our belief that the virus leaked sometime in late August or early September 2019. When they realised what happened, Chinese Communist Party officials and scientists began frantically covering up the leak, including taking their virus database offline in the middle of the night and requesting more than $1 million for additional security. They identified that there had been a previously unknown request in July 2019 for a $1.5 million improvement of a hazardous waste treatment system, which was remarkable because it was only 2 years old. That suggested there had been observed failures with the existing system that could well have been involved in facilitating a leak. They said that satellite imagery of Wuhan in September and October 2019 showed a significant uptick in the number of people at local hospitals surrounding the WIV. They pointed to the installation of a military bioweapons expert to oversee the WIV in late 2019, and then also actions by the Chinese Communist Party and scientists affiliated with WIV to hide or cover up the type of research that was carried out there. It also said this: in this addendum, we have uncovered further evidence of how top scientists of the WIV and Dr. Peter Daszak, an American scientist, furthered that cover-up. It said it believed that it was time to call on Daszak to testify before Congress. Now, as far as I can see, all of this is a valid proposition. As I said at the end of my first video on the lab leak hypothesis, that even if we couldn't know the truth, we should behave as though the hypothesis was true in terms of evaluating, for instance, whether it's a good idea that things like gain-of-function research carry on. Whether that translates into the global blame game is another matter. Some of the rhetoric from China has been getting increasingly heated. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, arguably the most powerful man in the world, said China should prepare for military struggle. On the one hand, there is a short-term issue. With the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, China is anticipating a Taliban resurgence, which seems a pretty solid bet, and that will lead to problems on their border. The biggest fear of theirs is that Uyghur separatists will gain a base of operations in Afghanistan from which to launch attacks on the CCP, which is why China has started holding talks directly with the Taliban. But of course, the wider theatre is conflict with the West. Xi Jinping has been consistent in his ambition to retake Taiwan as part of China, and this is the most likely flashpoint when it comes to a full-scale military conflict. And if the West comes to the conclusion that the COVID-19 scourge that we've all been suffering for 2 years came as a result of a Chinese lab leak, which they then covered up and denied, that could be in itself a tipping point from one status to another. What happens next needs skill and political judgment, so no reason to feel remotely nervous about that then. If you look at the social media streams, no one's much talking about any of this. Instead, they've been focusing a lot on the Olympics, and particularly the unfortunate dynamic around one Laurel Hubbard. Hubbard, a 43-year-old trans woman, a biological man who transitioned at the age of 35, was competing in the weightlifting. Now, I covered the issue of trans people in sports, and really, of course, it's trans women in sports, because that's where the question of unfair advantage, which is at the heart of the debate, comes in. Still, if people thought that genetics meant that Hubbard would clean up in this contest, they were wrong. Although Hubbard had lifted significantly greater weights before, indeed would have placed silver in this contest had the weights been repeated, in this case not a single successful lift was completed. Silver went instead to British weightlifter Emily Campbell. Gold was always going to go to the Chinese lifter Li Wenwen, whose performance is well ahead of the pack. And this led to the predictable baiting discussions between the two sides here. One saying that the fact that Laurel Hubbard did not win shows that there was no unfair advantage. Others suggesting that they believed the lift had been deliberately thrown to avoid the controversy that would have come with winning. As I covered with my video, weightlifting is one of the sports where an athlete having gone through puberty as a man does confer a significant advantage, and therefore one of the sports where it's hardest to make the case that rules around testosterone levels can provide fair competition. The argument that says, but it can't have been unfair if they didn't win, simply misses the point. It's like athletes using anabolic steroids. It's not that using steroids makes a mediocre athlete unbeatable, but if athletes are using them, they will get slightly better results than they otherwise would do, and in some cases that would include winning when they otherwise wouldn't have. No guarantee, but statistically it would make a difference. And that's why if you take part in a contest and it was discovered afterwards that you were doping, the fact that you didn't win your contest doesn't save you from a ban. It's considered to be unfair advantage regardless of the result. In this case, Laurel Hubbard, who by the way has simply been competing according to the rules laid down, so no blame to be attached there, but nevertheless Hubbard is 43 years old and was not a major athlete before transitioning. To be that age amongst a field of younger competitors and to have gone from mediocre to Olympian it's hard to suggest that there's simply nothing to see here. And it's good to have this discussion now, because next time it may well be a much more accomplished athlete who makes the same journey and then comes to dominate the sport. The International Olympic Committee has acknowledged as much, saying that its current guidelines for transgender athletes is not fit for purpose. Says that the science has moved on. Well, I'm not sure the science has changed. I think certain sports where evidence of a risk to women athletes, such as rugby, have seen scientists and others prompted to stand up to a loud campaigning element in ways that others have been reluctant to do. There does come a point where you need to ignore the noise and go to the evidence. Speaking of which, more has been emerging on the topic of ivermectin, the drug that some hope will be the effective response to COVID-19. And so far it seems to all be heading in one direction, not the direction that ivermectin's fans would welcome. Now, I covered previously how one of the more influential and important studies suggesting ivermectin was an effective treatment was exposed as having been deeply flawed and ultimately then was retracted. Well, some of the same researchers that did that now turn their attention to some of the other most important parts of the debate, namely this paper, which is the largest study that makes the claim that ivermectin is an effective prophylactic. In other words, if you take it routinely, then it will stop you from catching COVID-19. At the start of a long Twitter thread, Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz said this: "People have claimed that ivermectin is 100% effective as a prophylactic for COVID-19 based on an observational trial of the drug. I'm extremely concerned about this trial. It definitely should not be used as evidence for anything." The study was Carvalho et al. We saw a group of healthcare workers, some given ivermectin and carrageenan, and a second group not. It claimed astonishing results, with none of the people treated with ivermectin and carrageenan getting COVID-19, while a full 50% of the control group got sick. But Meyerowitz-Katz says that there are numerous obvious issues. First, it was received, accepted and published in 7 days. Unheard of speed, even in the pandemic. Second, it was published in an obscure journal. In fact, there's only one issue of this journal with just 7 papers in total. The About Us page is barely literate. There's no data about the method by which people were allocated into different groups. The table of results is incorrect. Both of the totals are wrong. The graphs are extremely low quality for an academic paper, and the authors pre-registered the trial, but the results they recorded for pre-registration don't actually match the results in the publication. So, for example, the first version stated that there were 72 women in the control group, but the final version reported just 51. There were numerous other points of detail, and Meyerowitz-Katz concluded this: as far as interventional, observational trials go, this is probably the worst one I've ever seen. Another reviewer, Kyle Shedrick, reported that the principal author of the study, Dr. Carvalho, has refused to release any data until the pandemic is over. That prompted the observation: authors refusing to communicate and share data is a very common feature of scientific fraud, e.g. Surgisphere. In a separate thread, Meyerowitz-Katz does a similar job dismantling the website ivermectin.com. I'd seen some general commentary by scientists that this website, which many people link to in the comments of the videos I've done on ivermectin, is of very low credibility. In the thread, he provides some forensic detail behind why it was ultimately what he describes as a pseudoscience site. I've never featured that site as evidence one way or the other, so I'm not going to go into it here, but I'll include a link to the Twitter thread in the video description if you want to look at that more closely. There was another study published this week that reviewed the various trials on ivermectin for the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. It looked at all the randomized clinical trials that met the risk of bias threshold and came to this conclusion: based on the current very low to low certainty evidence, we are uncertain about the efficacy and safety of ivermectin used to treat or prevent COVID-19. The completed studies are small and few are considered high quality. Several studies are underway that may produce clearer answers in the review updates. Overall, the reliable evidence available does not support the use of ivermectin for treatment or prevention of COVID-19 outside of well-designed randomized trials. When I started looking at this question, I followed what I understood to be the super forecasting approach and began with a 50-50 probability estimate that ivermectin would prove to be effective. You then review the evidence and nudge that figure in one direction or the other, depending on how persuasive that evidence is. The first nudge was positive, with the publication of the test lorry meta-analysis, some of the papers noting a correlation between countries that had used ivermectin as a prophylactic against river blindness and then subsequent levels of COVID-19 in those countries. Since then, I have to say the nudges have all been going the other way. And I'm around 85% likely now that ivermectin has no beneficial effect for COVID-19. Now, 85% is not 100%. I'm not inspired by the quality of the evidence coming from the advocates, which seems to be consistently of low quality. And the kicker for me came from an interview with Tess Lawrie from David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom.
What evidence would persuade you that ivermectin didn't work?
Ivermectin works. There's nothing that would persuade me. How much more proof does one need? It's 2 billion people, it's like the world's best kept secret. 2 billion people know about it. It works.
Someone who is not prepared to even contemplate that there might be any evidence out there that could prove them wrong because they've got such a determined belief that that would never be possible. That is not a reliable scientific narrator. Now, unfortunately, I can't provide a link to that video, which also included an interview with Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, because it's been deleted from YouTube, whether by Rebel Wisdom or by YouTube, I don't know. If I were forced to enter a prediction on the record today, it would have to be that ivermectin will be shown not to be effective by good quality studies, and the prediction as well that the advocates will reject that finding out of hand. Now, I don't have to make that prediction, so I will keep my watchful eye and my rolling tally of probability. If something emerges to nudge it back in the opposite way, nobody would be better pleased than I. Not least because it would be a huge riposte to YouTube for banning certain types of discussion about ivermectin on their platform. In the meantime, the small universe of highly influential commentators in this area, around Bret Weinstein and others, has completely dissolved into bad-tempered name-calling and public fighting. The quick version of this. Bret Weinstein, who with his wife Heather Heying has been an interesting and persuasive commentator on a number of aspects of this, and whose take on the lab leak hypothesis first inspired me to look properly at the evidence for that, he has been at the eye of a storm. Largely, as far as I can see, because he and Heather both stepped away from conjecture and consideration of evidence to embrace out-and-out advocacy, particularly around scepticism on the mRNA vaccines and ivermectin. And it's in the cause of the latter that Bret and Heather got to the point where they were interviewing advocates, pretty uncritically supporting their arguments, and then ultimately announcing that they were not vaccinating themselves and that instead they were self-medicating with ivermectin. Bret even took his first dose of ivermectin on the video, which you have to say is calculated to influence the audience with their own choices. This has been somewhat controversial amongst the group of heterodox thinkers around what used to be described as the intellectual dark web, a group gathered around Jordan Peterson. Bret ended up in a bad-tempered exchange with Claire Lehman, the editor of Quillette, the journal associated with that group. That then led to an article co-authored by Yuri Dagin, who had been a researcher on the lab leak story and who Bret Weinstein had interviewed on his podcast in relation to that. He turned on Bret with a very aggressive and dismissive framing, arguing that the Weinstein Dark Horse podcast was encouraging anti-vax sentiment and putting the lives of its substantial audience at risk if they acted on their advice. The Rebel Wisdom channel, which is the vehicle of David Fuller, got involved in the dispute, interviewing some of the principals, helping launch an initiative that would encourage constructive responses to the claims made by the Weinsteins, titled Better Skeptics, and led by a chap called Alexandros. You still with me? Believe me, this is the short version. But then David Fuller interviewed Yuri Dagin, an interview where he challenged him vigorously on some of his arguments, but nevertheless the mere fact of doing that interview outraged Alexandros, who then started accusing David Fuller of acting in bad faith. And then most recently, Brett Weinstein piled onto David Fuller, saying that your actions run counter to every value you claim to hold. And so on. You rather want to say to all of them, why are you doing this in public? The answer seems to be that everyone is deeply dug into their trenches, and whilst Fuller as a journalist was trying to do what conventional journalists do, discuss ideas and challenge them at the time, it turns out that some of the heterodox thinkers don't enjoy being challenged as much as they were supposed to. That's all I can see from it. It's unsavoury to watch. It doesn't seem to be about the having a respectful discussion, seeking truth, which is what the intellectual dark web group was supposed to be founded on. But it's a reflection of the status of the discussion as one where there are consequences to the actions that you take, and therefore the stakes are so much higher. People on Twitter were sharing this image and, rightly or wrongly, putting it at Brett Weinstein's door. Well, luckily we do get some people seeking respectful discussion in the comments sections of these videos on this channel. So let's look at a few of those quickly. I had this comment on the most recent video on the insect apocalypse. I love the detail in this. Sometimes I worry though that you almost lean the opposite direction and begin to speak as if the opposite of the claims is true. In this case, mass insect decline isn't a problem and just needs some more evidence to be proven. Similarly, you maybe insinuate pesticides aren't a problem without showing similar rigour to the discussion around them. As you said, there is sufficient evidence to say land use change and urbanisation pose significant risk to insect populations, as does water quality. Therefore, pesticides and fertiliser pollution, agricultural land use change and deforestation that are all trending in dangerous direction in many regions of the world are a direct threat to insect populations and are already having an impact. It feels like it would be worth underlining this sensible and evidence-based message whilst picking apart the sensationalist claims. If not, you risk adding to a narrative of the status quo is fine. First of all, thanks for the thoughtful comment. Let me deal with a couple of points of detail and then a broader observation. Firstly, in that video, I don't say mass insect decline isn't a problem. I say what the entomologists I referred to actually say. It's a problem in some areas, not a problem in others. Mostly worldwide, we just don't have any data one way or the other. And as I think I also said, not having data is a high risk factor, not a low one. Your more specific comment about whether I insinuate that pesticides are not a problem. It's not an area I've looked at. I made one observation that in that meta-study, insect population decline was not associated with agricultural land, which was an interesting element given how much Dave Goulson, who I was talking about, was pushing that specific element. Since I started doing videos looking at issues in detail and taking it to what the actual research does or doesn't support, I've learned not to presuppose things just because they have a popular narrative, particularly because campaign groups often influence the popular narrative through repetition of something that turns out not to be true. So I'd understood that bees were in danger of extinction, but they aren't. I'd understood there were only 30 or 60 harvests left before soil degradation rendered it infertile, but it turns out that commonly quoted stat was made up. So I don't know. And I have no instinct about whether claims relating to, for instance, neonicotinoid pesticides are true or not. The devil on these things is always in the detail. I have it on my shortlist to dive into that specific detail at some point soonish, because I'm now rather keen to know what the research base has to say on it. My broader point on the comment, as summarised by the end of your "it feels like it would be worth underlining the sensible and evidence-based message while picking aside the sensationalist claims," what this highlights is a very subtle balance thing, and a question about the centre of gravity for these videos and this channel. We have a number of issues in front of us at the moment, looming most large, climate change, and of course COVID, where we've gotten used to the idea that there are helpful discussions and then there are dangerous discussions. I've done videos unpicking both Extinction Rebellion overclaiming and climate skeptic cherry picking. to look at what the facts and the evidence say. But when I did the former, there's often been a pushback, which is, yes, these things they say may be wrong, but now you need to reinforce how important action on climate change is. Well, I've looked at the core science on climate change, done a number of videos on that, and it stands up to intense scrutiny, and I've then reported that. I've looked at the net zero by 2050 detailed plan of the UK Committee on Climate Change, and it seems a rational and mostly well-judged response, and I've said that as well, although other policy responses may be similarly defensible. But I try to avoid campaign messaging of any sort on this channel, except on the principle of free speech, because that's kind of essential for us to come to conclusions about stuff. Got a better proposal for what we should do about a topic? Show me the argument, show me the evidence. I will try to evaluate it with an open mind. Got a new argument as to why the whole issue of climate change is overblown or wrong? Well, okay, we've gone through a few of those, but if you have a new take, tell me the argument, show me the evidence. Let's have an open-minded look at them and see what comes out. There are many channels where people promote the narrative that climate change is urgent and therefore we need to do all the things that are possible for us to do. Those narratives may be correct, but there are no major proposals for big changes that don't get made better by intelligent scrutiny. And that requires commentators aiming for objectivity, as much as any human being can anyway, willing to ask the hard questions. Some people think that the issues are so important that such questions are unhelpful, just a weapon that you hand to the other side. Nothing is more helpful to the other side than badly thought out policies that bring unintended consequences. There's a difference between the scrutiny that says, I'm taking no side on this, I'm just asking what is true and what will be the consequences. And then the alternative that says, this is junk and you're all part of a communist conspiracy. Should be able to tell those two apart, it seems to me. Right now, the mainstream media, who used to routinely ask the hard questions, when they're at their best anyway, on both sides of a debate, they've now taken the line that the cause is so important that the underlying principles must not be questioned. Okay, although you should occasionally question them, but certainly not over and over again back to first principles. Fine, we need to move on. But then all too often that feeds through into never questioning any of the details of proposed policy. And that's a dereliction of duty. The government should be challenged on the cost of its climate change programme. Presumably it can defend its proposals and explain why they're good value for money. And if they can't, then they need better proposals. The fact that Extinction Rebellion will assume anyone asking hard questions is really expressing their love of fossil fuels or whatever it is they think, that shouldn't stop people from asking hard questions, because we need the right answers, not the wrong ones. And yes, of course, there will be a few people in the comments to these videos jumping all over certain questions. Does that really matter? We shouldn't be pretending there are no grey areas, no parts that are hard to solve, or areas where mistakes have been made just because we're afraid of what some people might say. That's my starting position anyway. It's kind of hard to articulate how it should play out in these discussions. No doubt I haven't got it right yet. Okay, one more question on the same video. Premise: by not having evidence for the vast majority of insect populations, we do not know if global populations are in decline. Possible conclusion: no need to worry about it or do anything differently. Is it possible that the not enough evidence model absolutely needs an actual catastrophic insect decline to occur for science to eventually obtain evidence of it and then lobby to try to change the causes of it? Is it possible that a precautionary principle approach is excluded by such need for evidence? Are we wedded to always causing a detrimental impact to mitigate? So if I'm paraphrasing that, I'm hearing, do we need evidence of something having gone seriously wrong before we can ever be motivated to actually do something? I think the answer to that is that it's mixed. Generally, I think we're pretty good at observing potential issues we need to know more about, commissioning the research that we then need to get better data. I think political leaders may think that if something's out of sight, that means there's no problem, but researchers and the funders of those researchers aren't always as blinkered as that. For all that I'm sure there are many faults in that system. There will be some areas that do get missed, people who don't understand their importance, but we do a lot of research on a multitude of areas. And the issue of insect ecosystems is an area that is being identified as one where we need better information, although that will focus on the areas where we perceive a particular vulnerability. So, for instance, there's been a lot more research into pollinators than in a number of other areas because of the implications of that. You mentioned the precautionary principle. I'm not a fan, because in the hands of politicians and campaigners, it does become simply a device to justify what they already wanted to do or not to do. I did a video on that specifically where I went into the detail. It's like many of these things, it's a perfectly sound principle behind it until you try to turn it into a system operated by human beings. All right, that's all we have time for. Let me know what you think on any of these topics in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.